Someone sent me along this render and asked how they might improve it to make it look more realistic, a bit less cartoon-like. Now, I don't profess to be an expert in rendering, but I could probably make a few suggestions that would improve it, and maybe there are some other people who could make some more intelligent comments. Let's go through the list of things that I would pick to improve this rendering. Firstly, I think the colors are too bright. The colors on the decking and the water are just too bright, so I would probably tone those down. Also, I think the whole thing lacks contrast. The difference between light and dark isn't that pronounced. Using an Hdri instead of ambient light. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. In the real world, what happens is that that light comes from a light source like the sun and produces these shadows, but that light also bounces off particles in the air and creates illumination that is separate from direct light from the sun, and the clouds would do the same sort of thing. So adding Hdri instead of ambient light would be a good thing to improve the realism. And with ambient light, you'll also get the sunlight coming down, bouncing off a surface, and then transferring some of the lightness or darkness or color from that surface onto adjoining surfaces. And we'll look at how to do that in a moment. I think removing the glow shader from plant textures is another one. We can see here that the plants have a bright, even though they're in the shade here in shadow. So removing the glow texture from those is going to make these respond better to whether they're in direct sunlight or not. Setting the sun position to your advantage. So in this case, if you did want some of the brightness of these plants to come through, then you'd want some of them to be in shadow and some of them to be in sunlight. And the way the sun is positioned at the moment, you've got this big shadow coming out here, so all of these plants along here are going to be in shadow. So I would probably tweak that sun position a little bit just to use it to your advantage. Creating some variety in the size of plants. Now you'll look here and you'll see that all of these plants along here are exactly the same size. These palms are the same size. So it's very simple with plants to create some variety. These are just image props, and you can edit the size of an image prop and very easily change the size to create some variety there. Generally in the real world, there are no sharp edges. Everything has a little arris on the edge, or a little rounding, or a little bevel on an edge. So if you have any key edges that you can see close up, then it will make them look more realistic if they're not sharp. And I guess the two that stand out here are this wall here. You even if you did that with bricks, if you go and have a look at a brick, the edge actually isn't sharp like that. And around the edge of the pool, that edge is not going to be sharp like that either. Now I know that might seem a fairly subtle thing, but in fact it can have an impact on the rendering. It's not going to matter on things that are further away, but these close-up areas, it's worth treating those if you've got anything in the foreground that you can see like that. I think in a scene like this, where you've got this is in Australia, you've got a swimming pool, and you want to create some nice colors there. This cloudy sky that has been used here is probably not what is going to produce this kind of blueness. If you want a nice blue water, then you're probably going to be looking at a nice blue sky. So I would probably change the sky and just tweak the rotation of that a little bit. I think some of the key textures need to be improved. So looking at the textures, I would say that maybe this one here, I think this grey texture here is very lifeless, and the water texture is not that good, and the glass texture is just not really doing what glass does in the real world. So they're the textures I'd probably look at editing and improving. And finally, adding some entourage. There's nothing in this image that suggests the real world, probably apart from the plant. So putting some people or a car or just something in there to just add a little bit of interest will also improve it as well. So let's now look at these things separately and see how we might achieve them. So going through these things one at a time, tone down colors and add contrast. Well, the HDRI is going to add a little bit of contrast, and turning off the ambient light is going to do that. But let's look at toning down some of the colors. I think let's take a look at the decking. Now, if you've got something that isn't quite as bright as this decking color, then you could, or this decking texture, you could use that. But if you just got that and you just don't want to spend too much time toning that down a little bit, then what you can do, and this is the texture that has been used there, if we edit the texture and we go to image color, you have the opportunity to add a filter color. And so what I've done to improve this is to just add a gray to it. And so instead of getting this really bright sort of color here that's over colored in the texture, I've added a gray, and this was about a 50% gray, and that's just going to tone that texture down a bit. This is also a way that you can change the color of a texture. If you don't have an alternative image to base it on, then you can also use this to put a color. So I've added some gray to that. Remove the glow shader from the plant textures though. So let's take a look at that one. And so this was mostly the guilty one was this one here, but probably these ones here as well. So if we look at this texture, what it had previously was this set to glow, and when you set that to glow, you see, I don't know if you just noticed, but these suddenly got very bright. And if you set that to glow, the plants are just going to appear bright like this regardless of whether they're in shadow or in light. So turning that off, I think, will also help as well. Using HDRI, so if we look at the viewport, and what I'll do is actually go to the lighting options, and I'll have to go to a design layer to do this, just to show you what I mean. So if we go to lighting, set lighting options, and what we're going to do here is to turn ambient lighting off. Ambient lighting basically just gives an overall illumination to everything, and it makes a scene lifeless. So either turn it off or set it to something very low, 5%, something like that, and then turn on indirect lighting. Now for an exterior scene like this, you can set it to 1 bounce. And then you want to create the background, or set the background that the HDRI lighting is being used. Now the sky here that's being used is mostly sunny. Now we could use that to generate the light from, but I actually prefer to use the HDRI white, which is one of the standard white shaders, or white HDRI backgrounds. And by using this, basically you'll just get a blast of light coming from the sky, and then you can adjust this brightness to achieve the effect that you want. So they're the lighting settings that I would be using for this. And once you do that, that HDRI light will then be imported into your document. And if we then look at Renderworks backgrounds, you'll see the HDRI white in here, and let's just take a look at that. And if we click on options, I've actually increased the brightness to 130%. The default is 100%. You really need to play around with this. Sometimes you need to brighten up a scene, sometimes you need to reduce this down, so it really just depends on the textures you've used and so on, but you can usually get a pretty good idea of whether this needs to be brighter or duller. Sometimes I might only have it set to 15%, other times I've set it to greater than 100%. And saturation is just the effect that the white color is going to have on things. If it's set to 100%, then the saturation, things are going to be made, the color of the sky is going to have more impact, or sorry, the color of the HDRI is going to have more impact. So they're the settings that I've used in this case. So the sun position, well, with the sun position, what I did was to move the sun so that the shadow, that these plants along here were slightly in the sun rather than being fully in the shade. Creating a variety in the size of plants, I mean, that's pretty easy to do. If we go to our model and click on one of the image props, you know, you've got the height and width here, so you just have to go through and you can change those as required. You can lock the aspect ratio or not, so you can make some a bit taller, you can make some a bit wider, or you can make them just bigger or smaller if you keep the locked aspect ratio. Remove sharp edges, so again, the way that you do that, going back to the model, and I'll look at the case of the wall over here. So what I did was, with this wall, I've added a little Aerosol Chamfer on the top of this, and to do that I used the Chamfer Edge tool, this tool here, and I think it was, you can see the chamfer is 6mm, so it's not very big, but I just put that on those top two edges there. I did a similar thing here with the edge to the pool. Previously this was actually a floor that had a different texture on the top and the bottom, so I actually created a separate little slab on the top here so that it enabled me to put that chamfer in there, but also have a different colored texture on this surface here, or this edge here. If we go back to this here, this edge here I also made darker by putting a darker color around there, which you'll see in the final render. I also changed the sky from mostly cloudy to mostly sunny, because I think that just gives a better effect. And I did rotate the sky a little bit, so if we edit that and click on options, you'll see that you have the ability here to actually rotate the HDRI, and sometimes rotating it you'll just get the clouds in a slightly different position, or it just gives a little bit of variety, and so you can tweak that just by playing with that number there. It's normally set to 0, so I set it to 100 and that looked pretty good. So the other thing I did was to play around with the glass texture, and I guess I'll just show you the settings that I've used for the glass here. So this was the glass. I didn't think it was reflective enough, so the transparency is set to 99%. The glass these days doesn't refract very much, so I set that to 1. You can see those other settings there. And with the mirror, I added a grey color and actually set the reflection to 500%. Now you can play around with this a little bit, but that was a setting that I found that worked. The glass is actually, exterior glass like this is actually very reflective if it's clean, and so you actually do want to see quite a strong reflection in that glass. And the object attribute, it's basically just picking up whatever the color of the original object is. So just looking at those again, the transmission is 99%, index of refraction is 1, and for mirror we've got that set at a grey 25% and a reflection of 500%. And for the water, we use the same image. So the image is this image here. There's no filter. I think I played around with the size a little bit, and transparency is just set to plain 80% because you want to see into the water a little bit, and here mirror is set to white with a reflection of 56%. I also have bump set to noise, and we can look at the settings there with blistered turbulence. Not much strength, but this just gives a little bit of waviness to the surface, and so will cause the reflection to not just be a straight mirror type of reflection. And for the paving, I'm trying to remember what we did for the paving. Basically I just added a texture for the paving here that was something other than just grey. And finally I added some Entourage, and it's up to you to kind of get that and put in something that's appropriate. So if we then look at ultimately what I came up with, so let's just quickly run through what we ended up with here. So you can see the plants here, the ones that are in the shade have less color. The ones that have some direct sunlight on them, you can see the colors are brighter. The color of the decking is toned down. You can see there's some variety in the plant sizes for both these plants and the palms and these palms up here. The glass here I think is more realistic, it's more reflective, but you can still see through it pretty well using that combination of 99% transmission but with a high reflectivity factor. And you can see the edge that's chamfered around the pool here. It's just taken that sharp edge off there, and you can also see that these edges aren't quite so sharp as they were previously. And the sky itself is mostly blue, which is what's going to produce the blue reflections on the pool. You can see with that mirror reflectivity added, you're actually getting some of the reflections transferred onto the pool, but they're being a little bit distorted by the bump shader that's been added there, so they're not completely flat. And a little bit of Entourage here just to add a bit of interest to the scene. So hopefully you agree that render is a little bit more successful than the original one.